Battery Bill. Battery Bill. For cameras, computers, cars, or scooters. For trucks, boats, jet skis, remotes. Battery Bill. Battery Bill.
Hey everybody, it's Fan Friday Talk Story here on ESPN Honolulu. Thanks for joining in. And today, I say today, but really this show is about this year, which is almost coming to an end. But this college basketball season was getting underway here around the state, around the country. But this is the 40th year since one of the greatest upsets in college basketball ever took place. And we're into maybe a next generation who may not be totally aware of what happened 40 years ago when Chaminade University, back then an NAIA school, was able to defeat the number one team in the country back in 1982, which was Virginia Cavaliers. And you think, wait, hey, they're still very good. But back then they were the top. They also had the best college basketball player in 7'4" Ram Samson. And it's 40 years since that. And joining us today is an author of a book chronicling that great moment. It's titled The Greatest Upset Never Seen, Virginia Chaminade and the Game That Changed College Basketball. And we're joined by Jack Danilewicz. And Jack, first of all, thank you for taking the time for being a part of it.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm always excited to talk about Chaminade's great victory, especially this year.
Is it not hard to believe that it's been 40 years? Because, every year we celebrate the Maui Invitational, which is on Maui, which is a tournament that kind of birthed, and people always say it was birthed from that great upset. But even then, when you have all those years of the Maui Invitational, it's hard to believe it's been 40 years.
Yes, I hate to think where that put us. I want you to know I wasn't an adult when that game was played. I was 13 years old at the time, and I was in 8th grade, and I was asleep. I was still living in Chicago. And I was actually still playing basketball. That's how long ago this is now.
Yeah, and neither was I at the game. And, most of us, like I was a young kid as well. And, you chronicle this event. Now, this book, which has been out on sale on Amazon and things of that nature, we'll talk about how to get the book. But what kind of inspired you to kind of write this book and chronicle this really one of the great historic moments, not only in Hawaii sports history, but like the title says, one of the greatest in college basketball nationally?
Well, the story actually starts in the Windy City. My parents used to come on vacation every spring, and my stepfather was a well-known basketball coach in Chicago, Len Scaduto of Oakland High School. And when he came on vacation, my parents just bought a condo to retire here, and he drove over to Chaminade and was hired on the spot as an assistant coach. This is the spring of '91. He was about 2 months from his retirement. And so they came home to Chicago, my parents, and told us all about this exciting news that he was going to be coaching at Chaminade, and then the Chicago media wrote about it. And so it was actually big news in Chicago, just the fact that he was going to coach at Chaminade. So then I join up in December. The following December, it was about 4 months later, so I came out here for a vacation. It was supposed to be a 3-week vacation, and I never went back. I called the paper and quit my job, and I had my furniture shipped. So my second night here, I went to a game at Chaminade. My stepfather, again, was now an assistant coach there, and I was there with Chicago Cubs beat writer Mike Deacon of the Daily Southbound. He was vacationing here, and so we were there, and I thought there was just a great story. I've always been in love with the underdog, and I had spent 4 years covering college basketball. Illinois, Northwestern, DePaul, and Notre Dame were my main 4 teams. There were 2 of us on staff doing college basketball. I usually got the leftovers, but the leftovers were pretty good because it was usually DePaul or a Big Ten game at Northwestern or Illinois if he felt like covering Notre Dame. So it was that kind of inspired me, and my love of the underdog really goes back to when I was a child. And I went to Northwestern's basketball camp every year. They were always a big underdog as the only private school in the Big Ten. And I was a football season ticket holder. So I was used to losing. And again, I was a big fan of the underdog. And I sat there that night, and I felt there was a story And so what I did was I arranged to get full access to the Chaminade team for the 92-93 season, to go through team meetings with them, to be in the locker room at halftime for all the home games, to be at all practices. And the coach, Darryl Lauderdale, accommodated me with that. But then I met the play-by-play announcer, Gene Davis, who had called the Chaminade, Virginia game and had been the play-by-play man for Chaminade on KGU during their heyday, and that changed everything. I then wanted to track down the players from 80, and that's a mouthful, but in a nutshell, there you have it, how we reached.
I think even people who were attended the game, and it wasn't a very highly publicized game. In fact, it was at the Blaisdell Center. This is pre-Stan Sheriff Center. Obviously, not like Chaminade, we're playing at the Stan Sheriff Center for the University of Hawaii, but it was at the Blaisdell Center. Can you try and capsulize when the magnitude in terms of the underdog, the upset, and just the gap that was between these two teams and programs at that time? I think a lot of times we throw the word upset around as, yeah, this is a team that's heavily favored over the other, but the gap that these two programs had, can you try and summarize that?
Well, of course, Virginia had an enrollment of, I believe, 30,000 at the time, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaking it with Michigan State. Sorry if I am. Chaminade obviously had 800 students, so there's a tremendous difference right there in the enrollment. But the main difference is in, obviously, recruiting and in the recruiting budget. Chaminade really had no recruiting budget to speak of. A lot of their players came to them because they'd struggled at a previous place. I think where they really lucked out, Chaminade, was in giving people a second chance, including Merv Lope's nephew, Mark Rodriguez, who appeared in all three of the major upsets, all four, rather, in 82, 83, 84. And he actually had transferred from Chaminade, Merv's nephew, Mark Rodriguez, and had returned. So I think Merv was rewarded many times over for giving players a second chance, certainly. In many cases, they were not heavily recruited. Tony Randolph was not heavily recruited, and Tony always kind of had a chip on his shoulder because of that. And that was just great material for Chaminade and Coach Merv, and the toughness that he usually looked for in players.
You know, Merv Lopes and that Chaminade team was just honored recently on the campus of Chaminade University, where a nice plaque and pictorial was put up there to commemorate 4 years. I mean, the head coach, Merv Lopes, is 90 years old at this time. I had the pleasure of interviewing him once. How many of all the interactions you may have had with him, what was kind of your thought about him as a coach and as a person?
Well, he had a great charisma. You know, he would finish a sentence and then he'd wink at you, like that. Great charisma, and I always made it a point to make sure that because he dressed so nice, I always made it a point to make sure that I was dressed nice. I never appeared around Mr. Merv Lope's t-shirt, for instance. I always had a collared shirt. And I can tell you about my first meeting. It was at a hotel down in Wake on a Saturday evening. He was in town for another matter. And the very first thing we talked about, before we talked about his background growing up in Nanakuli, his basketball background, anything, was the pre-game meditation and pre-practice meditation that Chaminade used to do every day. This is the very first thing that he discussed with me, and this is where we really started our friendship. And I had obviously many interviews thereafter, but I always found that interesting that this was a starting point for him in telling the story about that great team. Was his big thing was paying attention to the moment. He used to say, yesterday is not worth dirt. Now is all you have. And a lot of focus went into this. He also studied meditation in the beginning in the mid-'70s. Before he ever got to Chaminade, he was working on this, and that was at Kalaheo and Kailua High School.
And I remember, of course, there was a lot of media following Chaminade after that Virginia upset, because like you mentioned, they would have other significant upsets. They would upset Louisville. Denny Crum led Louisville twice. I think SMU, when they were ranked in the top 10. So they became known as the Giant Killers. It was like Virginia was the first of what would be a few more down the road. And I remember seeing a little thing about his meditation, and I asked him that too. And this is really ahead of the time in terms of now more and more coaches try to do things like mental wellness and focus. And his thing was be in the moment, but using trying to gain a psychological advantage over the opponent because they are underdogs. There always will be, but he always told his players, focus on the moment, on what you control. He would have, I remember I saw a video where he would have all his players just lie in the back on the court, close their eyes, and he'd be walking above them and he would be talking and just saying, stay in the moment, what you control. He was very much ahead of his time in that element.
Very much so. It was becoming more common in baseball than anything at the time that he began to coach that aspect. I don't know what we call it, coaching of the mind. But he was ahead of his time. He was his own sports psychologist, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
And then we look at how Virginia was. Like, we know Virginia was a program that was the tops in college basketball at the time. But I think people don't appreciate the player that they had in Ralph Sampson. We see 7-footers now all the time. Like, everybody has a 7-footer. If you're in D1, if you're in the NBA, you see all these 7-footers around. You see athletic 7-footers now all the time where they can handle the ball, they can face the basket. He was 7'4", athletic, could handle the ball, preferred to face the basket, could also play in the post. Now you look at Antetokounmpo and you think, yeah, he's crazy talented. That was Ralph Sampson back in 1982-83, and we had never seen anything like that before.
Yeah, I think he was kind of before his time in terms of his shooting range, for one, could play away from the basket. But I think where his real gift was around the basket. He had great quickness, and I think he doesn't look that strong necessarily in person, but he played very strong. I think he was very strong physically where he needed in his upper body. As far as the Chaminade game, as we all know, one of the strategies was to defensively anyway, move him away from the basket, and they were lucky to be able to do that because they had Tony Randolph, who had great range for his side, and that was obvious to the game. I think one of the other things was Virginia went through a stretch where they had more turnovers over a 3-game period, including a season high against Chaminade, than they had throughout the rest of the season.
I remember, I can still remember some of the players. I remember Tim Dunham was their great point guard, but he was a small little guy, only like about 6'1". You mentioned Tony Randolph. They had 2 local kids on their starting lineup. Richard Hainish was their all-conference player. Jason Strickland, I think, was a power forward. Tony Randolph was a center. I think he was maybe listed at 6'7", but I think he was actually 6'5", going up against 7'4" Ralph Sampson. After doing all of the research, talking to the people, and you write this book, what do you think was the key elements to how this upset came to be?
Well, I think as far as their on-court play, they shot the ball very, very well, Chaminade did. And these were not easy shots. If you've seen the film, Tony in particular had made a lot of shots where he may have been open, but he just got those shots off. There's a play where Richard Hainish is moving from the elbow to the free throw line and makes a shot. He's being defended, I think, by, I'm not sure who it was. It may have been Ricky Stokes, but it's very well defended. And in fact, it goes in off the backboard, not really the way you would plan it. So I think Chaminade really shot the ball well. And then I think their guards never flinched. They were not able to pressure Chaminade's backcourt, and that would have been obviously Mark Rodriguez. He was in there. Mark Wells was the starting guard, and then Tim Dunham, as you said. The player I'm asked most about is always Tim Dunham, who was kind of the Michael Jordan of Chaminade basketball that year. He was their leading scorer, I think, at night. So he's the one that players really remember because he had incredible leaping ability and, of course, had the famous alley-oop dunk right behind Sam's game, which was regarded by most Chaminade players as the turning point of that game. They had given up a 7-point lead and made it back up right away, and from then on, they led the rest of the way once they got them.
I think it's one of those things where I joke with people, like, do you remember what was the attendance of the game?
I do. It was 3,383 were there. About 3 times that amount say they were there now, but there were 383 at the game.
Exactly, right? It's like the fishing story, right? You catch that fish that's about this big, but 10 years later, that fish is this big. The crowd that saw that game, 3,000, seems like it's like 20,000 has seen that game. And that's the unfortunate part, is that maybe in an era like now, if that game was scheduled, the media, even though the big disparity in the 2 programs, that would have been pumped up because the number 1 team is coming into town, which you didn't see much back then. Also, the fact that any Hawaii team, much less even the University of Hawaii, could not draw such a marquee top 25, much less the number 1 team in the country. So I often credit Chaminade for pursuing that I think it was Virginia was playing in Japan or something, right? And they were making a trip back to the continental United States. So the athletic director, I believe Hank Vasconcelos, was the one who contacted this university. Hey, you want to schedule a game? And why not? Virginia's like, sure, we'll take a game in between flights. We can wipe the court with you guys and head back and have another win. I mean, I credit Chaminade for taking the initiative to make this arrangement.
Well, they had wanted to play Hawaii, Virginia had, but they just couldn't get in. There were no openings for the Rainbow Classic, I think it was they were trying to. What a lot of people don't realize is that Chaminade and Virginia met 3 times during Sam's 4-year career. His freshman year, they met at McCabe Gym, which was quite an interesting evening for those who were able to attend. And then in his junior year, exactly a year before the upset, they also played at the Blaisdell. It was a fairly close game for a while. So this was the 3rd time they were playing. And in the earlier game, they had actually got Curly Fujita, their manager, up on a ladder with a broomstick to try and simulate what it would be like to shoot with Samson, his 7'4" height and reach. They didn't do any such thing before the main upset in December of '82. They kind of played it straight as far as that went. But 2 things they did do is they decided they weren't going to back down as far as trying to, if the fast break was there, they would take it. They weren't going to settle in necessarily to a half-court game. That was one.
Amazing. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm glad I was alive during that period, but I sure as heck wish I was one of the 3,000 that were at the Blaisdell that day. And it's unfortunate not too many people were there, but those who actually were, I mean, you saw history. The book title, again, is The Greatest Upset Never Seen, Virginia Chaminade, and the Game That Changed College Basketball. Where can you still get the book, by the way?
Well, Amazon is one easy way to get it. You can order it online many, many places, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, even. But if you want it, if you're in a hurry to get it, the Chaminade bookstore is the best place. They have it right there in stock. Barnes & Noble has some copies, too, down in Ala Moana. I signed some books for them. And lots of options. But I think a lot of people have been going over to the bookstore. Those that are impatient like me and don't want to wait for a book have driven over there. So I'm very grateful to them for displaying the book, obviously.
Okay, now, you wrote that book, I believe it came out in 2019, based on The Underdog. You have another project working on, which is a topic that's not what anyone would consider an underdog. It was about Ara Parseghian, one of the legendary coaches of Notre Dame football. So now we switch gears a little bit. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, and not a lot is known about the time he spent at Northwestern, which was from 1956 to 63. And so my book ends when he goes to Notre Dame. I just wanted to cover, obviously I delved into his past before that in his childhood, but it's mainly about his time at Northwestern, and more specifically it's about the 1962 season when they were ranked #1 for 2 weeks in the polls. And during a 2-week span, they beat Ohio State in Columbus and then came home and beat Notre Dame in a non-conference game in Evanston. And it was the following day, that Monday, that they were ranked #1 in the AP poll. They've not been ranked #1 since, although they've had some great teams there in recent years. But this was also during a real tumultuous period for America. These 2 weeks of when they beat Ohio State and Notre Dame were also the 2 weeks when we were going through what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so that kind of put a damper on things. College kids worry less about worldwide matters than perhaps their parents do, but it was still a trying time for anyone living through it. And so I've always found that interesting. I was really fascinated with the time period. These were the Kennedy years, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Era's last game was 6 days before the Kennedy assassination. So his time there was very involved. And Era was somebody who followed the news. Coaches like to say they don't read the papers, but nothing escaped Ara Parseghian. He read everything, and he, according to his wife, did watch the news quite a bit. He was very involved.
Did you have a chance to communicate with him at all?
I did not. Funny story, I had this book in mind for many years, and many years ago I was sent to Notre Dame for Media Day by the Daily Southtown, and Ara was there with his grandchildren. He used to come back to Media Day every day, and when I was done interviewing who I was supposed to interview, which was Coach Holtz, and I was doing a story for the next day's paper on a linebacker named John Foley, Chicago area kid. And when I was done interviewing John, I walked over so I could hear the great man conducting his interview. But I had no idea at that time, this is 1990, that I would be writing a book about him someday. And he had passed away, sadly, before I took on this project. I did interview his widow, Katie Parsegian, who is 94 now, and she's like 64. She has an incredible memory and really clear speaking voice. She's a great woman and perhaps the ultimate coach's wife.
Yeah, the coach's wife. You should write a book about that, because that is I mean, nobody knows about that, but the sacrifices that, of being a spouse of a coach who's never around, and, raising a family with, your dad, and plus the traveling and, relocating. I mean, there are some stressors there behind the scenes that most people don't realize, regardless of how much the contract is that a head coach has.
Yes, the Parsegians had three young children at the time he was at Northwestern, and they didn't see him very much during the season, especially even on Sundays by 10 a.m. he would have left and gone in to the office. But she was very supportive of this. She used to sometimes bring the kids over to practice, she said, so that they could, quote unquote, know their father, because it was such a busy job. But this was a critical time in their lives, and Arrowhead they were very happy there, but he had a falling out with his boss, which was Northwestern Athletic Director Stu Holcomb, and this is why he decided to inquire about the opening at Notre Dame in November of 16.
What's the official title of the book, and then when is it due to come out? What's the status of that?
I can give you my working title, but the title is always decided between the publisher and the writer, and so I'm not sure what the title will be. The one that my working title was An Era to Remember, Era Parsegian's Northwestern Years. So we'll see if that passes with that.
And so, potentially coming out next year?
Well, it's generally 9 to 12 months. I gave it to them August, so I'm thinking we'll see it just before the season.
Okay.
Yes, just before the upcoming football season. And the Northwestern community could use some good football news, because they just had their worst season since 1989. I was covering Northwestern football in 1989, so I have a very clear recollection of that time there. So.
No doubt. And Northwestern, like you said, an underdog. So you have another potential story on the horizon.
Yes, I am writing about a high school basketball team from Oak Lawn, Illinois, which the town had been decimated by a tornado 4 years before in 1967, and it all came together in 71, and so it's about this high school team, which played in one of the most famous games back in Illinois. Back in 1971, 792 teams made the state tournament, and at the end you just had two, and it ended up being two Chicago area teams, Oak Lawn and Thornridge. So it's one of the great games ever played in Illinois, and it's the last year of the one-class system. In 1972, Illinois began to crown two state champions, separating by enrollment.
Oh, kind of similar to like the Hoosier story of Indiana, right? Back then, at that time, was one class, and you would have that, what the story of the movie became about. We had a big school versus a small school, but they since then classified into different levels.
And I think I missed that. I am sorry to see that Indiana has gone to classes. I think they have 4 state champions now, and so I kind of missed, frankly, the old days. Not to sound like an old timer, but I missed those days when it all came down to one game, everybody in one tournament.
Yeah, it is an element that, not too many states continue to run. But thank you so much for helping us celebrate 40 years since the arguably the greatest upset in college basketball history, when Chaminade, little tiny Chaminade, defeated number 1 ranked Virginia back in 1982 of December in this month. Thanks so much for taking the time to be a part of Fan Friday Talk Story, and we hope you have a great holiday season.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure, and wish you the best for your family and for the holidays as well. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you.